Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture on biosafety and containment in microbiology, specifically focusing on the different biosafety levels from BSL 1 to BSL 4. This topic is central to both basic and advanced work in microbiology, especially when handling organisms that range from harmless to highly dangerous. Whether you're working on a bench in a teaching lab or preparing for clinical diagnostics or research involving high-risk pathogens, understanding the principles behind biosafety and the infrastructure that supports it is essential. In this lecture, we'll not only define what each level means, but also explore the laboratory practices, personal protective equipment, and facility designs required at each level. We'll examine real-world examples of organisms handled at each BSL and look at how biosafety intersects with both public health and regulatory compliance. So, let's begin by looking at the learning objectives that will guide our discussion. To make sure we stay on track, here are the learning objectives for today. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to define the concept of biosafety and explain why it is critical in microbiological settings. You should also be able to describe each of the 4 biosafety levels, understand how they are determined, and recognize the differences in lab design and personal protective equipment across levels. I also want you to be able to name example organisms that would typically fall under each level and appreciate how containment strategies prevent accidental exposure and environmental release. Lastly, we'll briefly touch on the regulatory framework in the EU and specifically in Germany, so you're aware of the legal aspects of biosafety in practice. This is not just academic theory, it's what keeps people safe in real laboratories, so let's treat it with the seriousness it deserves. Let's start with a fundamental question. What exactly is biosafety? At its core, biosafety involves the application of a set of containment principles, laboratory practices, and safety equipment aimed at preventing unintentional exposure to pathogens and toxins, or their accidental release into the environment. The purpose of biosafety isn't only to protect the individual working in the lab, although that's certainly a big part of it. It's also to protect the environment and the general public from potential exposure. Now think about the layers of defense. First, there's the proper handling of biological materials. This includes training, standard operating procedures, and use of appropriate PPE. Then we have containment equipment such as biosafety cabinets and autoclaves, and finally, the physical infrastructure, walls, doors, ventilation, and so on. All of these elements work together to create a safe working environment. Without biosafety, even a minor mistake could result in a significant public health issue. Now here's a common point of confusion that we need to clarify early on. Risk groups and biosafety levels are related, but they are not the same thing. Risk groups classify microorganisms based on their pathogenicity, mode of transmission, host range, and availability of treatment or vaccines. There are 4 risk groups from RG1 to RG4, with RG1 being the least risky and RG4 being the most dangerous. For example, E. coli K12 is in RG1, meaning it poses no known threat to healthy individuals. On the other end, you have Ebola virus in RG4, a pathogen that causes severe disease and has no effective treatment. Biosafety levels, however, are a set of practices and design standards in labs, and they correlate with, but are not solely determined by, the risk group of the organism. For example, under some conditions, an RG2 agent might be handled in a BSL-3 lab. So, understanding both concepts and how they interact is crucial to determining the right safety measures. Now that we understand what risk groups are, let's delve into the concept of biosafety levels or BSLs. Think of BSLs as operational tiers that determine what kind of lab setup you need to work safely with particular microorganisms. These range from BSL 1, which is appropriate for organisms that pose minimal risk, to BSL 4, designed for work with life-threatening agents. Each level has its own set of protocols for lab access, facility design, containment equipment, and personal protective measures. Importantly, the assignment of a BSL isn't just about the organism's risk group, it also considers how the organism is used. For example, growing salmonella on an agar plate for a diagnostic test may require BSL 2, but aerosol-generating experiments with the same organism may demand BSL 3 containment. so context really matters. Here's a comparative overview of the 4 biosafety levels. This table summarizes the progression from basic to maximum containment. At BSL 1, we're dealing with organisms like E. coli K12 that are non-pathogenic. Standard microbiological techniques and basic PPE like lab coats suffice. At BSL 2, the stakes are higher. You might be working with Staphylococcus aureus or influenza A, and you'll need biosafety cabinets and routine access control. At BSL 3, you're in a controlled environment with serious pathogens like Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Here, airflow becomes crucial, and respirators are often necessary. Finally, BSL 4 is for the highest-risk agents, viruses like Ebola and Marburg. These labs have the most rigorous controls, including positive pressure suits and airlocks. Each level builds on the previous one, adding more layers of containment and complexity. Keep this structure in mind as we go into the specifics of each level. So let's start with BSL 1. This is the level you're most familiar with from teaching labs. It's used for organisms that do not consistently cause disease in healthy adults. The lab design is quite simple: an open bench, a sink, and perhaps a disinfectant station. Work is generally done on the bench top without specialized containment equipment. Gloves and lab coats are recommended, but not always mandatory. Think of this as the starting point for lab safety. Examples of organisms you might handle include Bacillus subtilis or E. coli K12. However, even at this level, standard microbiological practices like hand washing, labeling, and proper waste disposal must be rigorously followed. BSL 1 may be low risk, but it still requires a culture of responsibility and good lab habits. BSL 2 is the most commonly used biosafety level in clinical and teaching labs dealing with human pathogens. It involves agents that can cause disease in humans, but are typically not life-threatening, especially with proper medical treatment. Organisms include Salmonella, Hepatitis B virus, and Streptococcus pneumoniae. You'll need biosafety cabinets for procedures that could produce aerosols. There should be restricted access, and training is required before anyone can start working in a BSL 2 lab. PPE becomes more essential. Gloves, lab coats, and sometimes face protection are standard. Waste must be decontaminated before disposal. Overall, BSL 2 introduces more rigor in lab practices while still being feasible in most university or hospital settings. Now we come to BSL 3, which is a significant step up in terms of containment and risk. This level is used for pathogens that can cause serious or potentially lethal disease through inhalation. Examples include Mycobacterium tuberculosis, SARS-CoV-2, and Yersinia pestis. Laboratories must be designed with sealed penetrations, double-door access, and directional airflow, meaning air flows into the lab but not out. All work with infectious material should be done inside a certified biosafety cabinet. PPE includes lab gowns, double gloves, and often a respiratory protection system like an N95 or powered air purifying respirator, PAPR. BSL 3 labs are often used in diagnostics, research, and vaccine development. Working in a BSL 3 environment requires not just technical skill, but also discipline and mindfulness about every action. Finally, we reach BSL 4, the highest level of biosafety, reserved for agents that pose a high risk of life-threatening disease, for which no vaccines or treatments exist. Ebola and Marburg viruses are classic examples. These labs are extremely specialized. They require complete isolation from other lab areas, dedicated ventilation systems, and multiple levels of secure access. Workers must wear fully encapsulated positive pressure suits with independent air supplies. All materials entering and exiting must be sterilized, often with double-door autoclaves. Entry and exit protocols include chemical showers. BSL 4 labs are rare and are usually found in national or international reference centers. Working in a BSL 4 lab is not just a job. It's a discipline that involves months of training, simulations, and psychological readiness. Let's take a moment to consolidate what we've discussed so far with this quick reference table. It's helpful to see all 4 BSLs lined up against key operational features. For instance, notice how the pathogen risk increases dramatically from BSL 1 to BSL 4. Similarly, the type of PPE and the need for specific containment infrastructure escalates. BSL 1 allows for open bench work with minimal protection. BSL 2 introduces biosafety cabinets and a more structured waste management process. At BSL 3, we start to see significant physical containment requirements like controlled airflows and respiratory protection. Finally, BSL 4 is in a league of its own, with full body suits and rigorous decontamination protocols. This table serves as both a memory aid and a decision-making guide for anyone designing or working in a microbiological lab. Keep in mind that while these levels are standardized, specific institutional policies or national regulations might add further stipulations. Let's now talk about some of the critical equipment used to ensure containment. One of the most important pieces is the Biosafety Cabinet, or BSC. There are 3 main classes. Class 1 cabinets provide personnel and environmental protection, but not product protection. Class 2 cabinets are the most common, offering protection for personnel, product, and environment via a HEPA-filtered laminar airflow. Class 3 cabinets, on the other hand, are completely enclosed, gas-tight systems used primarily in BSL for labs. Then we have autoclaves for sterilizing media and waste, decontamination showers, and pass-through boxes with UV light or chemical disinfection. All of these tools are designed to serve as both a physical and procedural barrier. Equally important is ensuring this equipment is regularly maintained and certified. A malfunctioning BSC is not just ineffective, it's dangerous. So, knowing how to use and inspect this equipment is an essential part of biosafety training. Containment is not just about having the right equipment, it's also about having the right practices in place. These include writing and strictly following standard operating procedures, SOPs, for every aspect of lab work, from how to enter and exit, to what to do if there's a spill or exposure. Good record keeping is also essential. For example, every time an agent is removed from cold storage or transferred between labs, it should be documented. Waste management must follow precise protocols to ensure that no hazardous materials exit the lab unneutralized. Training is another pillar. New staff should undergo theoretical and practical training before being allowed to work independently. Annual refreshers and emergency response drills are recommended, especially at BSL 3 and BSL 4. The idea is to create a culture of safety where everyone feels responsible not only for their own safety, but for the safety of their colleagues, the environment, and the public. Let's look at a couple of real-world incidents that highlight why biosafety matters so much. The first case occurred in the UK in 2007, where a strain of foot and mouth disease accidentally leaked from a high containment facility due to a broken drainage pipe. The virus didn't escape due to sloppy lab work, but because of a failure in the building's infrastructure. This incident shows that biosafety is only as strong as its weakest link. The second case happened in the United States in 2014, where anthrax spores were inadvertently shipped from a BSL 3 lab to lower containment labs due to improper deactivation. This highlighted the importance of validating procedures and maintaining a questioning attitude even toward routine tasks. These incidents resulted in costly investigations, reputational damage, and most importantly, near-miss events that could have had grave consequences. They remind us that biosafety is not just about compliance, it's about accountability. Now, let's briefly examine how biosafety is regulated, especially within the EU and here in Germany. The EU Directive 2000/54/EC lays out the framework for protecting workers from risks related to exposure to biological agents. In Germany, these regulations are further detailed in the technical rules for biological agents, known as TRBA. The most relevant documents are TRBA 100 and 120, which provide guidelines on classification, protective measures, and facility requirements. These rules are legally binding and overseen by agencies like the Bundesanstalt für Arbeitsschutz und Arbeitsmedizin (BOA). Laboratories are regularly inspected, and certifications must be updated periodically, especially for BSL 3, and BSL 4 facilities. If you're planning a career in clinical diagnostics, biotech, or academic research, understanding these standards is vital. It also helps you align your lab's practices with both national and EU legislation, reducing the risk of both accidents and legal noncompliance. Let me summarize the key points from today's lecture. First, biosafety is the foundation of safe and effective work in microbiology. It's not optional, and it's not just paperwork. There are 4 biosafety levels, each matched to a certain risk profile of the organisms handled. These levels influence everything: how the lab is built, what equipment you use, what procedures you follow, and how you behave. BSL 1 is minimal risk, while BSL 4 involves high-stakes, high-containment work. We've discussed the importance of containment equipment like biosafety cabinets and the value of proper practices, SOPs, training, and waste management. Real-world incidents show us what can go wrong, and regulatory frameworks guide us in doing things right. Biosafety is not static. It evolves with new pathogens, new technologies, and new global risks. As future scientists and lab professionals, your role in upholding these standards is both a responsibility and a form of service to society. Now that we've gone through the major content, I'd like to open the floor for discussion. Let's think critically. For example, why do you think some pathogens like SARS-CoV-2 have been handled at both BSL-2 and BSL-3 depending on context? What factors influence that decision? Consider not just the pathogen's properties but also the type of work being done. Then there's dual-use research of concern, or DURC, where scientific findings could be misused to pose a threat. How does biosafety address these ethical dimensions? If you were designing a new diagnostic facility in a developing country, what biosafety considerations would you prioritize first? I want to hear your thoughts, your questions, and your concerns. This is the kind of engaged dialogue that biosafety protocols aim to support, not to limit innovation but to enable it safely. To deepen your understanding, I highly recommend exploring the following resources. Read them not just to pass exams or meet requirements, but to truly understand the systems that protect us. I also encourage you to bring up any questions or insights from these readings in our next seminar. Also, like, subscribe, and share.